So you've been interested in playing the shadowy boy in the Necromancer because, let's be serious, anyone who can control undeath instantly has your attention. The Necromancer still has quite a bit of complexity between skills, weapon choices, minions, self-inflicted curses. It can be a lot for a new player. Well, that's where I'm going to help you. This is how to play the Necromancer and their elite specializations. While the emphasis will be on the core spec, I will briefly touch on the Reaper, the Scourge, and the Harbinger. First, let's go ahead and talk about the profession mechanic in the Death Shroud. This bar fills up with life force as you utilize skills and abilities. Once you have some life force, you can activate the Death Shroud, which gives you a brand new set of incredibly powerful abilities. On top of that, the Shroud acts as a secondary health bar. It drains quickly while within the Shroud, but taking damage will remove the Shroud even faster. The Shroud can be activated with only a little bit of life force, but generally speaking, it works better to have higher amounts before stepping into the Shroud. Not only does it deal some great damage, but it has crowd control, movement abilities, and even an area life sap that helps you stay in Death Shroud for longer. Once exited, the Necromancer will not be able to enter the Shroud for a short time. Managing your Shroud and your life force in some cases may be tricky, as staying inside of the Shroud for a while is generally the best. However, it may be better suited to utilize some of the abilities for a time and then swap out for some of your weapon skills. The Traitlines of the Necromancer have a variety of different skills and choices that can fit a number of playstyles depending on how they would like to approach combat. The Spite Traitline tends to focus more on strike damage, which is damage done instantly from weapons and skills. Whereas the Curse trait line has a heavy emphasis on condition damage, which is damage done over time, or dots. Death Magic is oriented around defenses by granting Carapace, which gives you stacking toughness from a variety of sources. Toughness reduces the incoming strike damage that you take. This trait line also improves minions. Pay attention to that one. The Blood Magic trait line gives a ton of lifesteal and sustain and can even stop allies from bleeding out when they are in down state. And Soul Reaping massively improves your Shroud ability and also allows you to inflict a number of conditions from the main Shroud attack. These can all synchronize extremely well and allow for a lot of unique build styles, although the Necromancer tends to be leaning towards the condition damage oriented builds. The Necromancer has a variety of weapons at their disposal, as well as being able to swap between two weapon sets while in combat. Probably the most popular for the Necromancer is the Staff. This weapon offers a ton of conditions, crowd control, and some decent damage. This weapon also has incredible range at 1200 units. The Scepter is a condition damage oriented weapon that can slow and bleed enemies while also taking buffs from the enemies and turning them into conditions. The Axe, however, is more strike damage oriented, where it can inflict a ton of vulnerability, which causes the target to take more and more damage as it stacks higher. The Axe can also convert enemy buffs, which we call boons here, to conditions. Both the Scepter and the Axe are mid-range weapons, whereas the Scepter has 900 units and the Axe has 600 units. The Dagger is by far the closest weapon with a range of 130, but it is excellent at sapping health from enemies and also inflicting a number of conditions. The Offhand Dagger has an emphasis on transferring conditions and bleeding enemies in an area at range. The Focus can steal health while also inflicting a number of vulnerability stacks onto the target, as well as being able to rip boons from the target, dealing heavy strike damage. The Warhorn fears enemies and grants some lifesteal while also giving some swiftness to allies. Swiftness allows you to move significantly faster for a short period of time. Which weapon combo do you like the most with the Necromancer? Tell me down in the comment section below. The utility skills for the Necromancer have quite a few variety of paths that can be taken. Because the Necromancer can transfer a lot of their conditions to enemies, some of the skills of the Necromancers, specifically the Corruption line, inflicts conditions on the Necromancer themselves. The management of those conditions can be key, and hence why the Necromancer tends to lean heavily towards the condition damage builds, as they have a variety of ways to handle and enhance them. The Necromancer also has well abilities, which summon powerful area of effect that benefit allies and typically decimate enemies. Signet abilities have passive and active effects. Passively, they offer some moderate effects, while their active abilities tend to be much more powerful. Once used, the Signet's passive abilities go on cooldown until the Signet comes back up. These tend to be more defensive and healing skills. A really unique skill set to the game that the Necromancer has access to is spectral skills. These function usually in a defensive manner, breaking crowd control, creating protective areas, and helping the survivability of the Necromancer. And possibly the best reason to play the Necromancer is their minion skills. These summon small bone and flesh creatures that attack and rip away at your enemies. Each one of these minions also have an extra ability that either controls enemies or deals damage. Regardless of the approach, the Necromancer has a diverse skill set to handle any situation. The Necromancer generally thrives in all forms of content in Guild Wars 2. Their minions can overwhelm and devastate enemies, while the sheer amount of conditions rot away at their health bars. Because of the fairly easy and simple nature of the Necromancer, they can usually take more aggressive skills, emphasizing damage and improving their shroud capabilities. Given that most of the Necromancer abilities are at range, they can safely assail targets and kite with various movement abilities without much difficulty. When handling elite or champion mobs, your skill kit may have to change to focus a bit on protection and defenses, maybe taking the death magic traits for the overall increase to toughness to pair with the high health bar and shroud abilities. Even large groups of enemies can be decimated by the crazy amount of area of effect damage that the Necromancer brings to the table. Now, even when kitted out to be straight power damage, the core Necromancer doesn't burst as well, say, as a Thief or even a Mesmer. But where it lacks in upfront damage, it makes up for it in consistent damage over time. When leveling a Necromancer, I recommend filling out the minion skill set first, as once the Necromancer has minions to tank and distract enemies, it makes the rest of leveling incredibly simple. The minions tank, you DPS. It's pretty straightforward. I'd also recommend choosing the Soul Reaping trait line first, as this improves your main shroud ability, where a good percentage of your overall damage should come from. The trait line also increases how long you can stay in the shroud, as well as reducing its cooldown after you left. Lastly, as you're leveling, I'd personally say try to avoid using the dagger main hand, as it requires closer range and potentially tricky combat. Not saying that it's a bad weapon, but I feel like sacrificing the range with everything else that you use isn't worth it. Perhaps this is just my opinion here. If you are a new player, make sure to like and subscribe to the Caffeinated Dad gaming channel, where we talk about all sorts of shenanigans here in Guild Wars 2. The Necromancer can go a number of different ways when it comes to gear stat choices, depending on the end game mode. In open world, they can utilize any major forms of stats, such as Berserkers for strike damage or Vipers for condition damage, or even go with the Celestial route, which increases all of your stats. Celestial tends to be a great pick here as well because of the hybrid damage that the Necromancer brings to the table. On top of the Death Shroud abilities and minions make this incredibly durable and moderately strong stat choice. Because of the high HP pool and the access to Shroud as a secondary life bar, the Necromancer can of course go into more damage-oriented routes, which here I'd recommend Viper's gear set for the overall damage for condition builds, or a cheaper alternative maybe switching over to a power-focused build and picking up the Berserker stat line, as these pieces can be bought for significantly less amount of gold. Whichever way you decide to go, you can make great use out of any of the common gear stats. For rune choices, especially if you're running a condition build, I'd suggest Rune of Nightmares, as for a very common condition damage trait in Terror, causes your fears now to inflict damage. The duration is further improved by utilizing this rune. If you're going to go the power route, you can run the Scholar runes, as for the most part you will be fairly healthy dealing with most enemies. The Reaper is without a doubt one of the most fun elite specializations in the game. It puts the Necromancer into melee, giving them a massive greatsword, and then changing their Shroud ability into Reaper Shroud, a highly offensive oriented version of the Death Shroud. It decays significantly faster, but it makes up with it for pure damage output. One specific ability to note is Gravedigger, which deals massive damage after a windup. However, if it strikes an enemy who is below 50% HP, the cooldown is reset, allowing you to spam this. The Greatsword has a variety of controlling abilities, ones that inflict condition or pull enemies closer towards you. The main feature of this elite specialization is the chilling effect. Chilling slows enemies down and causes them to move slower and slows down the recharge of their abilities. When the Reaper attacks chilled enemies, they deal massively increased damage to them. The Reaper also gains the abilities to use shout skills, which buff the Reaper and debilitate enemies. Overall, this spec is ice cold. The Scourge is the Path of Fire elite specialization for the Necromancer, and it is incredibly versatile when it comes to build flexibility. This spec forgoes a Shroud altogether in favor of Shades. Shades are summon areas that inflict torment and can utilize the other Shade abilities. As a Scourge is in combat, it generates Life Force, and the Life Force can then be spent utilizing these Shade abilities. These can inflict fear, convert conditions on allies to boons, grant incredibly powerful barriers, and even pulse torment to enemies and pulse barriers to allies at the same time. The Scourge grabs a torch as a weapon, which inflicts a number of conditions and can even crowd control some enemies. The Scourge also gains access to punishment skills, which inflict a number of conditions on enemies, whilst also applying a significant amount of barrier to any allies within that area. The Scourge can function amazingly as a conditioned DPS or as a support, given the sheer amount of a barrier that they can apply. This spec really brings the heat. The Harbinger is the End of Dragon's elite specialization for the Necromancer, and it is highly offensively oriented. The Harbinger forgoes the extra health bar for their Shroud to amp up the damage massively. Even more aggressive, they inflict themselves with Blight, a stacking reduction to their total health pool. The Harbinger Shroud is significantly more aggressive than the other Shrouds, offering high damage and mobility at the sacrifice of the aforementioned extra health bar. The Harbinger also learns how to utilize elixirs that have a variety of effects. When they throw them at enemies, it deals damage and inflicts conditions. Once the Harbinger reaches a certain amount of Blight stacks, their elixir abilities deal double damage and inflict more conditions on the enemies. When not throwing elixirs, the Harbinger utilizes a pistol loaded with noxious bullets to inflict conditions and damage enemies. This spec really lives on the edge. The Necromancer has a wide variety of skills, traits, and ability to handle anything Tyria can throw at it. Despite being a light armor class, it is incredibly powerful and easy to pick up and play. The Necromancer provides some of the most unique gameplay combat across any MMORPGs, as again, who doesn't want to master the powers of undeath? If you want to learn more about the Reaper, the elite specialization for the Heart of Thorns expansion, click this video here. Stay caffeinated, folks.